So if you're working as a health, fitness, or a wellness professional and you have clients come to you that have lost their gallbladder and maybe they want to supplement with some ox bile or purified bile salts to kind of help their digestion improve, it can be a little more complicated than just, hey, take 2 of these, it's all going to be great. So in this video, I'm going to give you some factors to think about with your clients to help them either adjust the timing of that ox bile or the dose of that ox bile, because most people that are going to use ox bile, there's going to be some complications and some things that need to be adjusted to really help that optimize the digestive process. Let's jump in.
TC Hale is not a doctor and does not claim to be a doctor or licensed in any type of medical field. Don't be an idiot and use anything heard on the show as medical advice. This information should be used for educational purposes only, and you should contact your doctor for any medical advice. Now get off me.
Now, ox bile and purified bile salts are becoming a lot more popular lately because a lot of people are understanding the benefits that it can really bring about to help us emulsify our dietary fats, access fat-soluble vitamins in the foods that we're eating, and really just digest our food the way that it should be digested. And for someone who's lost their gallbladder and no longer has this bile coming down to help us digest our food correctly, they're likely going to have to supplement with ox bile or purified bile salts indefinitely. And a lot of people who have lost their gallbladder that are going to come to you for help are having significant health issues. But it's also possible for someone to have had their gallbladder out 10 years ago and have no symptoms show up at all. And we'll kind of talk about how that can happen. But for most people who've lost their gallbladder, eventually some of these troubles that we're going to talk about are going to come up, and helping them correct these problems is not going to be a simple one-size-fits-all for each client. You're really going to have to help clients adjust some things and figure out some things by trial and error. So to understand why these adjustments are needed, we need to understand the natural bile function of the body. So bile is this soapy substance that's made by the liver, and then the liver sends it down here into the gallbladder where the bile is stored and it's concentrated. So the bile gets concentrated in the gallbladder so that a small amount then is more effective when it's helping us digest our food. And then when we eat food, the stomach makes hydrochloric acid, or HCl, and that's meant to help us start to acidify that food so that we can break it down correctly, so that we can get the nutrients out of that food that we're eating. And then once this food is acidified, it leaves the stomach and goes down into the duodenum. Some people say duodenum. I think it's more fun to say duodenum. And when it comes down here, this acidic product coming into the duodenum like that is what triggers the gallbladder to say, hey, I'm going to squirt this alkaline bile down to help neutralize those acids and digest the food the way that it should be digested. Because when this acidic product from the stomach meets this alkaline bile coming down from the gallbladder, those opposite pHs meeting and colliding creates like a sizzle. And that sizzle is what helps us bust that food apart and get all of the nutrients out of that food. And the bile also helps us emulsify or break down those dietary fats so they can be used by the body. If those fats are not digested correctly, they can rot and ferment and become problematic to the body, where they're more of a burden to the body. Now the body's got to figure out how to get rid of them instead of being able to utilize those. So this bile coming down is actually very important. This acidic product leaving the stomach, the bile is what helps neutralize those acids. Now there's some bicarb that comes from the pancreas that helps neutralize a little bit too, but we really need the bile to help neutralize those acids. Because if the food just continues to move through the intestinal tract in that acidic state, well, those acids are made to help us break down proteins. Well, guess what the intestinal tract is made of? Yeah, it's protein. So if these acids continue to move through in that acidic state, then they're going to basically digest a hole in the intestinal tract. And the body doesn't want that to happen, so the body will bring any water that it can to cool off those acids, and then it rushes through the system really, really fast and shoots out the back door and lifts your client off the toilet like a rocket. And they get this crazy diarrhea stuff that is so common for those who have lost their gallbladder. Now, that doesn't mean everyone who's lost their gallbladder is going to have diarrhea, but it's probably the most common symptom that we see from folks who have lost their gallbladder. And it makes sense because there isn't that bile to come down and neutralize those acids. Now, when the gallbladder is removed, the liver still is making bile, and it should come down this biliary pathway and come down into the duodenum, and that bile coming down there kind of all the time can help neutralize some of those acids and help some people digest some of their fats and stuff like that. So if this bile is flowing well enough, then the person might not really experience any symptoms. They may go through life and everything is just great, and I don't have gallbladder attacks anymore, so that's awesome. And they'll feel great about having their gallbladder removed. But for a lot of people, there's not enough bile coming down, and they don't really have that bolus of bile that comes down when the gallbladder is triggered by this acidic product hitting the duodenum. Maybe if someone's eating a lot of fat, that can trigger that gallbladder to squirt bile down as well. But when there's not that bolus coming down, a lot of times there's just not enough bile to neutralize the acids that are coming from the stomach. Now, if a client is not producing enough stomach acid, which is very common, then they may not get a loose stool because the food leaving the stomach is really not in the acidic state that it should be. So there's not a lot of acids that need to be neutralized. So they might not have a problem. But another thing to consider is that sometimes this bile gets so concentrated in the gallbladder that it's not flowing correctly. The bile's too thick and sticky to flow, so it kind of stays in the gallbladder even when it's being called on. It just can't move out. And the gallbladder's job is to concentrate, so it'll continue to concentrate in that gallbladder until it concentrates into sludge or even stones. And then we get the gallbladder attacks and somebody takes that gallbladder out. But a lot of times, if this is getting so concentrated into here, it can also thicken up this bile in this pathway. And so maybe they'll take the gallbladder out, but if they don't take steps to clear out this pathway, then the bile is not flowing the way that it should flow, even when the gallbladder is gone. So we want that bile to flow correctly, because when the liver filters toxins and junk out of the body, it puts a lot of that into the bile, so that when the bile comes down into the intestinal tract, it's carrying those toxins with it through the intestinal tract, and then those toxins go out the back door when we poop like a champion. So we want that bile flow working correctly. So even if someone's had their gallbladder removed, it doesn't necessarily mean that that bile is still flowing. We like to see clients take steps to thin the bile and make sure that that pathway is moving correctly. So we'll put a link in the description below for our video on 5 steps to help clients thin out their bile. And that can be very important even for those who've lost their gallbladder. Now, if someone still has their gallbladder, but they're showing signs of not digesting their fats correctly, or maybe they're having loose stool issues, it's possible that the bile is just too thick and sticky to flow correctly. And then we don't usually use ox bile in those scenarios, and you're going to understand why in just a second. We like to see those clients take those steps to thin out the bile to get their natural bile flow working the way that it's supposed to work. So when someone's lost their gallbladder and they don't have that bolus coming down, the only option is really to supplement with ox bile and allow that to come down through the stomach and into the intestinal tract to help neutralize those acids. But here's the problem. That stomach is supposed to be acidic, and remember, this bile is alkaline. So if someone's taking ox bile in their stomach, they're actually neutralizing the acids in their stomach. They're making that acidic environment less acidic. So the biggest mistake that we see people make is they're taking ox bile with their meals. All the manufacturers even say, yeah, just take this with a meal. Everybody tells them, just take it with a meal. It's going to help you digest your fats. But they're actually turning off their digestive process when they put the ox bile in the stomach with their meal. They're neutralizing those acids and removing their ability to properly acidify that food. So that's a really big problem. So when we're looking at this trial and error and trying to adjust the timing, we really like to see people take ox bile away from their food. That way the food has time to acidify properly in the stomach, and then they take the ox bile away from the food to help neutralize those acids so it moves through at an appropriate pace. Because remember, when it leaves here and it's too acidic and it doesn't get neutralized, it's going to scream through the system too quickly. Now, keep in mind that some people with their gallbladder will have constipation. That's absolutely possible, and that's often because they're not making enough stomach acid, because that stool, that bolus, moves through the intestinal tract at a pace according to its acidity level. So when those acids don't get neutralized and it's too acidic in that intestinal tract, it's going to move through too quickly. The body's rushing it out the back door so it doesn't digest the intestinal tract. But when that stool is more alkaline, it will move slower and the person can have constipation issues. We're going to talk about some other possible constipation issues in a second, but it's important to understand that the pace of the stool is giving you information to help the client make adjustments to the ox bile. But that's why we try not to use ox bile with clients that still have their gallbladder. We want the natural bile function to work so the bile can come down here outside of the stomach. The bile should not be in the stomach. That's a problem to have bile in the stomach. It's going to neutralize those acids. So if you can help someone's bile flow naturally, then it'll work the way that the body's supposed to work and we really get to digest our food correctly. But again, if someone's lost their gallbladder, they're going to need something to help neutralize those acids and help emulsify their dietary fats in most cases. So when it comes to needed adjustments, we first want to look at the dose of the ox bile. And we've seen people do well taking 1 ox bile, maybe 2, maybe 3, even 4. It's really going to vary from client to client. So make sure you understand there is no one-size-fits-all situation. But we like to see somebody eat their food, let that food acidify for 60, 90, or 120 minutes, and then take ox bile to come in and help neutralize those acids so that when it moves in here, it will move through at an appropriate pace where it's not still in that extreme acidic state. But for some clients, you might see that, oh wow, I'm really bloated when I eat. And when I'm taking this ox bile, it can magnify those bloating issues. And that's because, remember, the bile is alkaline. So bloating usually comes from not having enough stomach acid. And so that food is rotting or fermenting and creating all these gases and pressure in the stomach. Or there's a bacterial overgrowth in the stomach. And bacterial overgrowth can also exist further down the small intestine in like a SIBO situation. But in most cases, there's bacteria in those wrong places where they should not be because there's not enough stomach acid there. So when someone's not producing enough stomach acid, it's not only there to help us digest our food, that stomach acid is like the barrier to the whole body. When we're eating food and microorganisms come in on that food, when those varmints come into the stomach, they should die in an acid bath. That stomach acid is there to fry them and keep them from moving into the system and setting up camp and raising their kids and having a keg party and creating all kinds of havoc. So we want that stomach acid function there. So if somebody's bloating, ox bile in there could magnify that by alkalizing that stomach even further. If somebody's having acid reflux, the ox bile could magnify that as well. That reflux is coming from not enough stomach acid. It's the stomach acid that's supposed to trigger this LES valve at the bottom of the esophagus to close after the food comes in and starts to acidify. But that valve is not getting triggered because there's not enough stomach acid. So then the small amount of stomach acid that's there then comes back up and burns them and they get acid reflux and heartburn and all those kinds of symptoms. So if they're having that problem already from a lack of stomach acid and they put ox bile in the stomach, that could magnify that situation. The trick is this can be really difficult when someone doesn't have a gallbladder because the steps to fix that is to help acidify the stomach even more. Maybe supplementing with some apple cider vinegar or a betaine HCl that can help acidify that stomach correctly. But if they do that and there's not enough bile to come down and neutralize the acids when they leave the stomach, if they're having a loose stool issue, they could really magnify that loose stool issue by increasing that stomach acid. So it becomes a very kind of tricky situation where you have to help them figure out the timing of the ox bile that's going to work for them and maybe help acidify their stomach and in a way that they can keep that stool moving at an appropriate pace. So that's the other factor that helps us figure out do we need to adjust that dose is the stool speed. If the stool is moving too slow and the person is constipated, then adding ox bile to that could make them more constipated by alkalizing that stool even further. If the stool is moving too fast, they may need to increase that ox bile dose to slow it down, to put more alkalinity into that stool so it can slow down and move at a more appropriate pace. So any of these issues where they're bloated or having reflux or stool is moving too slow, then we don't want to add more ox bile because it could magnify all those issues. The other thing is we want to adjust the timing by figuring out, okay, maybe we're just putting the ox bile too close to the food and it's creating that reflux or magnified bloating. Maybe if we let it acidify a little bit longer and move the ox bile to maybe 2 hours after the meal, then maybe it'll improve that bloating or reflux. So with bloating or reflux, we might want to move it away from the food. But if you're having more of loose stool issues, then you might want to move it closer to the food, maybe only 60 minutes after the food, or even more if they're having diarrhea right after their meal. So you might have to move it closer to that to help neutralize those acids faster. Maybe they don't break down the food as well as they could have if they acidified it longer. But if food is screaming through the system with diarrhea, they're not assimilating those nutrients anyways, because it's all rushing through the system too fast to actually get anything out of it. So we always want to really slow down the diarrhea as a priority. We also see people with loose stools sometimes benefit from taking a dose in the morning or at night, or both. Or maybe they just wake up and they take a dose of ox bile before they've eaten anything and just let it move through the stomach and get into this intestinal tract, so there's that alkaline bile in there, so that when they do eat, maybe 45 minutes, an hour later, they eat the food and then it moves through in that acidic state and it catches up with that alkaline bile and seems to have the ability to slow it down for some people, just taking those extra doses like in between meals or right when you wake up or maybe just before bed. So we hear from a lot of clients that benefit from using that situation. But we also need to think about other factors like what's going on with the stomach acid. Are they not making enough, or are they maybe making plenty and it's just everything's moving too fast? So we'll put a link in the description below for our video on 10 signs your clients are not making enough stomach acid, so you can get an idea of what may be going on with that as well. But we also need to consider a client's circadian rhythm, because it was Dr. Emmanuel Rivisi who helped us understand that the body has this natural circadian rhythm at the cellular level. So during the day, the body should be in this catabolic state where it's very good at creating energy and breaking down tissues so that things can be rebuilt and renewed. And then at night, the body should move into this anabolic state where it's very good at sleeping and resting and repairing and rebuilding things. So we see both of these states are appropriate. We want both of these things to happen. The problem is a lot of clients will get stuck in one of these states most of the time. Or maybe their chemistry is just really pushed really far in one direction. And if that's the case, it can create a wide variety of health issues. So if somebody's stuck in this catabolic breaking down state most of the time, the body tends to send more of its water to the bowels and less to the kidneys. And those people can often end up with some chronic diarrhea issues because too much water is going to the bowels. And in this anabolic state, the body tends to send more of the water to the kidneys and less to the bowels. Maybe they got to get up 5 times in the middle of the night just to pee because the body's sending more of the water to the kidneys and less to the bowels, and that can create some constipation issues. So we see that when we're looking at these stool issues, like is the stool moving too fast or are they constipated, we have to take more things into effect than just what's going on with stomach acid. There are other factors that can dictate how the stool is doing. And if you want to understand how to look at a client's chemistry to see if they're leaning too far on that anabolic or catabolic side, we'll put a link in the description below for our video on helping clients fix their circadian rhythm. But also my book, Health Pro Results, walks through how to help clients figure out if they're leaning too far on that anabolic or catabolic side. And chapters 3 and 4 of that book also help you understand how to help clients figure out which aspects of digestion might need improvement. And the book is available on Amazon, but I'm going to put a link in the description below so you can get the whole thing totally for free, and that'll help you understand those things a little bit better. And you might also need to think about some tudca options. And tudca is like a synthetic form of ox bile. And a lot of people feel like it can be very effective for some of these things that we kind of talked about. Maybe a client is a vegan and they don't want to use an animal product. You could use tudca, that's a synthetic version of ox bile, so to speak. But a lot of people feel like that tudca doesn't really neutralize acids the way that bile or ox bile can. So a person could take tudca and maybe they're going to help their body digest those dietary fats, which can really be beneficial. Sometimes if someone can't digest those dietary fats, that can irritate the intestinal lining to where the body's like, just get these undigested fats out of here, and that can create a chronic diarrhea issue. So taking tudca could help improve that and improve diarrhea in that scenario. But if the diarrhea is caused by acids not getting neutralized, a lot of people feel like it just doesn't have that same effect. So we really like to use ox bile if we need to use one of these things with a client, but just know that tudca might be an option if for some reason they don't do well with the ox bile. You can always test out the tudca to see if that's beneficial and maybe use it for clients that don't have the ability to use ox bile. So you can see that's a lot. That's a lot of information to understand and to test out with your clients. And you probably have to watch that video 3 times just to understand everything that I just said. But it helps you understand why some clients are like, oh yeah, I use Ox Bile, that didn't work for me. Oh, that made me feel worse. Or that caused this problem. It's because you have to understand everything that's going on and understand that that can really vary from client to client. So we're really going to have to come back to this trial and error situation and adjust that timing of the Ox Bile or the dose of the Ox Bile to figure out what's going to work for each client. Now for the clients that still have their gallbladder, jump over right now and check out our video on helping clients improve bile flow, and you can help those clients fix this so that they won't have to use Ox Bile. I can't wait to hear about your results.